10 years ago. I stood watching his building burn, the one he called his dream. But only I knew the truth. The one who lit the match wasn't fire. It was him. He destroyed my family with nothing more than a signature and a cold smile. I swore I'd come back. And I did return. Not with a gun, but with a plan so slow, so vicious, so irreversible that by the time he realized what was happening, it would already be too late. My name is Claire Donovan. And I wasn't always someone who lived for revenge. 28 years old now. But back then, I was just 18. A small-town girl from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, with dreams no bigger than finishing community college and maybe opening a bakery downtown. That was before Richard Callahan entered our lives like a plague dressed in an Armani suit. The memory still burns fresh, even after a decade. It was a Tuesday morning when my father came home early from the hardware store he'd run for 30 years. His face was gray, hands shaking as he clutched a stack of legal papers. Mom rushed to him, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as their world, our world, crumbled in real time. "They're taking everything," he whispered. "The store, the house, even the rental properties." Callahan's lawyers found some technicality in the deed transfers from 1987, said we never properly owned any of it. Richard Callahan, even then, his name carried weight in Oklahoma. A real estate mogul who'd built his empire on the bones of small businesses and family dreams. He had this gift for finding legal loopholes, ancient paperwork errors, forgotten easements, anything that could tear ownership away from decent people and into his manicured hands. The next 3 months were hell distilled into its purest form. Dad hired lawyers we couldn't afford, fighting a battle that was lost before it began. Callahan's legal team was a machine, grinding us down with motion after motion, delay after delay. Each court appearance draining our savings like blood from a wound. I dropped out of college to work double shifts at the diner, watching my parents age 10 years in 10 weeks. The day they lost the final appeal. Dad had his first heart attack. He died in the ambulance, Mom's hand in his, while Callahan was probably sipping champagne in his Dallas penthouse. Mom followed 6 weeks later. The doctors called it complications from pneumonia. But I knew better. She died of a broken heart, pure and simple. I remember standing in the rain at her funeral, watching them lower her into the ground next to Dad. In a cemetery plot that would be the only land Richard Callahan couldn't steal from us. There were maybe 12 people there. The town had already moved on, afraid to associate with the family that had challenged Callahan and lost. That night, I sat in my rusted Toyota outside the gleaming tower of Callahan Enterprises' regional office. Through the lit windows of the top floor, I could see him, Richard fucking Callahan, hosting some kind of party. Laughing, celebrating another acquisition, another family destroyed, another fortune built on suffering. I made a promise to myself in that moment. Engine idling, rain hammering the windshield. Not a hot-blooded oath of immediate vengeance, but something colder, more deliberate. I would dedicate my life to destroying him. Not with violence, that would be too quick, too merciful. I would dismantle everything he'd built, piece by piece, until he knew what it felt like to lose everything that mattered. But I was smart enough to know I couldn't do it as Claire Donovan, the broken girl from Broken Arrow. I needed to become someone else entirely. Someone with power, someone with access. Someone Richard Callahan would never see coming until it was far too late. The next 10 years weren't living, they were preparing. I disappeared from Oklahoma completely. Became a ghost with a purpose. Started in Chicago, working nights cleaning offices while attending community college during the day. Not for a degree that would look good on a wall, but for knowledge that would become weapons, accounting, corporate law, psychology of manipulation. I learned that revenge isn't about anger. Anger burns too hot, too fast. Revenge is about patience, about becoming someone your enemy would never suspect. So I killed the old Claire, piece by piece. Dyed my auburn hair blonde, learned to speak without the Oklahoma drawl. Trained myself to smile when I wanted to scream. By year 3, I was in New York, working at a hedge fund under an alias, Sarah Mills. The job was gray market at best. The kind of place where you learned how money really moves, how corporations hide their sins in shell companies and offshore accounts. My boss was a cocaine-fueled psychopath named Derek, who taught me more about financial warfare than any MBA program ever could. When the FBI finally raided the place, I was already gone, with enough knowledge to understand exactly how Richard Callahan's empire functioned. Years 4 through 6 were spent in law school, night classes at a third-tier school in Philadelphia. I didn't need the degree, I needed the understanding. Corporate structure, contract law, white-collar crime. I studied Callahan's cases obsessively, memorizing every lawsuit, every acquisition, every dirty trick he'd ever pulled. My apartment walls were covered with documents, timelines, corporate trees. I lived inside his business model until I could predict his moves before he made them. During those years, I also began building my network. Started online, in forums for people who'd lost everything to corporate raiders. Found others who'd been destroyed by Callahan specifically. There were dozens. A farmer in Kansas who'd lost ancestral land. A small hotel owner in Texas driven to suicide. A family in Arizona whose construction business was gutted and absorbed. I reached out carefully, never revealing my real name, but organizing them, keeping their anger fresh, their evidence preserved. Year 7. I moved to Denver, started working at a consulting firm that counted Callahan Enterprises among its clients. Finally, I was close enough to study him personally. I learned his habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. He had a thing for blonde women under 30. He drank Macallan 25 exclusively. He was paranoid about his son Matthew, worried the boy was too soft to inherit the empire. He had a mistress in Aspen and a wife who stayed for the money. I spent year 8 and 9 perfecting my new identity, Elena Moore. Built her a flawless history, Ivy League education, stellar recommendations from companies that existed only on paper but would pass any background check. Elena was everything Richard Callahan would want in an employee: brilliant, ruthless, beautiful, and seemingly desperate to prove herself in his world. The hardest part was learning to control my hatred. There were nights I'd wake up shaking, remembering my father's face when he realized we'd lost everything. My mother's empty eyes at his funeral. I'd stand in front of the mirror, practicing my smile, the one Elena would wear when she finally met Richard Callahan. Not too eager, he'd suspect that. Just confident enough, hungry enough, cold enough to catch his attention. By year 10, I was ready. I'd spent a decade becoming someone else, accumulating knowledge like ammunition, building a network of people who wanted Callahan destroyed almost as much as I did. I knew his business better than his own executives. I understood his psychology better than his therapist. I had become the perfect weapon, forged specifically to destroy him. The morning I submitted my application to Callahan Enterprises, I stood in my Denver apartment, looking at the photo I'd kept hidden for 10 years. My parents on their 30th wedding anniversary, 2 months before Callahan destroyed them. They were smiling, holding each other, completely unaware of what was coming. Almost time, I whispered to them. I'm finally ready. The glass towers of Callahan Enterprises pierced the Denver skyline like a middle finger to God himself. 42 floors of steel and ambition, with Richard's office crowning the top like a predator surveying its territory. The morning I walked through those revolving doors as Elena Moore, I felt nothing. 10 years of preparation had burned away everything except purpose. The lobby was all marble and intimidation, black stone floors that reflected the chandelier's cold light, security guards who looked like ex-military, receptionists beautiful enough to be models, but with eyes that assessed everyone as either threat or opportunity. I wore a charcoal suit that cost more than old Claire made in a month. Louboutin heels that clicked authority with every step. Elena Moore didn't walk. She arrived. Ms. Moore, welcome to Callahan Enterprises. The HR director, Patricia Winters, greeted me with a smile that never reached her eyes. Mr. Callahan likes to personally welcome all management-level hires. He'll see you at 3. The first few weeks were reconnaissance. The office culture was exactly what I'd expected. Fear dressed up as ambition. Everyone watched everyone, reported everything, trusted no one. Richard had built a corporate ecosystem based on paranoia and competition. Departments were pitted against each other for resources. Bonuses were public, designed to breed resentment. Terminations happened on Fridays, always at 4 p.m., always with security escort. I started in strategic development, a fancy title for the department that identified acquisition targets, essentially, finding the next family business to devour. My supervisor, James Kramer, was a sweating alcoholic who'd survived 8 years by being too pathetic to be seen as a threat. Perfect for my purposes. Elena, fantastic work on the Morrison portfolio analysis. James wheezed on my third week, holding my report with shaking hands. Richard's going to want to see this personally. That's how I first entered his office. The top floor was a different world, hushed, pristine, smelling of leather and old money. Richard Callahan stood with his back to me, looking out at Denver through floor-to-ceiling windows. 63 years old but carried himself like 40, silver hair perfect, shoulders squared in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. The Morrison family owns 17 properties across 3 states, he said without turning. You found something my team missed for 2 years. How? They were hiding assets through a trust in their daughter's married name, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage boiling in my chest. The paperwork was filed in Nebraska, not Colorado. He turned then, and I met the eyes of the man who'd murdered my parents. They were gray, like winter sky before a storm, and utterly without warmth. He studied me the way a snake studies a mouse, deciding if it's worth swallowing. Clever, he said finally. I appreciate cleverness, Ms. Moore. Tell me, what would you recommend regarding the Morrison acquisition? This was the test. Show too much compassion, and I'd be dismissed as weak. Show too much ruthlessness, and he'd see me as a threat. I'd practiced this balance for years. The daughter's going through a divorce, I said. Financial pressure will make her vulnerable. Offer to buy just her share of the trust, below market. But enough to cover her legal fees. Once we own a piece, we can force a partition sale of everything. Richard smiled then, and it was like watching a corpse try to remember happiness. Brutal, efficient. I like it. James, you're reassigned, Ms. Moore, you report directly to me now. Within 3 months, I'd become indispensable. I worked 18-hour days, not from dedication, but from necessity. I needed access to everything. Richard began inviting me to senior meetings, then to private strategy sessions. He'd call me at midnight with ideas, test his plans against my intelligence. The other executives hated me, which only made Richard trust me more. In his world, being hated meant you were winning. You remind me of myself at your age, he said one evening, bourbon loosening his tongue. That hunger, that willingness to do whatever it takes. I smiled, the one I'd practiced 10,000 times in the mirror. I learned from watching the best. Mr. Callahan? He had no idea how true that was, every night. I went home and documented everything, every crime, every confession, every skeleton in his corporate closet. The evidence was mounting. But I needed more. I needed to get so deep inside his world that when I finally destroyed it, there would be nowhere for him to run. Richard Callahan had 3 critical weaknesses, and I studied them like a surgeon studying cancer cells. First, his greed. Not just for money, but for the feeling of taking something from someone else. Second, his marriage to Victoria, a former model who discovered his affairs years ago and stayed only because divorce would trigger a prenup clause that would leave her with almost nothing. Third, and most exploitable, was Matthew, his 30-year-old son who had all of Richard's ambition but none of his intelligence. Matthew was soft, where Richard was hard, emotional, where his father was calculating. He'd been given a vice president title, but everyone knew he was a placeholder. A disappointment Richard couldn't quite bring himself to discard. I started with him. Elena, thank God you're here. Matthew cornered me after a board meeting where his father had publicly eviscerated his proposal for expanding into sustainable development. I need someone who actually understands strategy. I touched his arm gently, felt him lean into it like a starved dog. Your idea wasn't wrong, Matthew. The presentation just needed refinement. Over the next months, I became Matthew's confidant, his advisor, his validator. I'd stay late to help him with proposals, always adding just enough of my own mistakes to ensure they'd fail spectacularly. But I'd frame these failures as Richard's blindness, not Matthew's incompetence. Your father just doesn't understand modern markets, I'd whisper after each humiliation. He's stuck in the old ways. When you're in charge, things will be different. The beauty was that Matthew started believing he was smarter than his father. He began making side deals, small at first, investing company funds in projects Richard hadn't approved, hiring consultants with inflated contracts in exchange for kickbacks. I helped him hide these transactions, badly enough that they'd eventually be found, but well enough that he felt like a genius. Meanwhile, Victoria Callahan and I developed our own relationship. I'd accidentally run into her at charity events, gallery openings, the spa. She was 55, maintained by the best surgeons money could buy. But her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been pretending for too long. You work too closely with my husband, she said one afternoon at the country club, 3 martinis making her honest. Be careful. Richard destroys everyone eventually. Even family? I asked innocently. She laughed bitterly. Especially family. Ask him about his brother Thomas sometime. Oh wait, you can't. Thomas killed himself after Richard stole his company. I filed that information away. Another bullet for my gun. Richard himself was harder to manipulate directly, but greed made him predictable. I started identifying acquisitions that looked perfect on paper but had hidden problems. Environmental liabilities, pending lawsuits, union issues, but I'd present them as golden opportunities, too good to pass up, needing immediate action. The Garrett Industries deal, I told him one night, spreading documents across his desk. They're desperate. We could get it for 60 cents on the dollar if we move now. What's the catch? Richard asked, always suspicious. No catch. The owner's going through a messy divorce, needs liquid cash immediately. But 3 other firms are circling. We need to move tonight. What I didn't tell him was that Garrett Industries had been dumping chemicals for a decade, carefully hidden in their subsidiaries' records. The EPA investigation would hit 6 months after acquisition, long enough that Richard couldn't back out, soon enough that the cleanup costs would be devastating. Richard signed. He always signed when he smelled blood in the water. The most delicate manipulation was turning father against son. I'd schedule Matthew's presentations for when Richard was most irritable. I'd accidentally let Richard see emails where Matthew questioned his decisions. I'd mention casually how Matthew had been talking to competitors. Probably nothing, but you should know. He's weak. Richard spat one evening after Matthew had fumbled another presentation. 30 years old and still acts like a child. He's trying. I defended Matthew just enough to seem fair. Maybe he just needs more responsibility, a chance to prove himself. Richard's eyes narrowed. You think I should give him the Phoenix Project? The Phoenix Project was a massive development in Arizona, worth $200 million. It was also built on land with title disputes that my network had been secretly filing. Matthew would fail, spectacularly and publicly. It would show tremendous faith in him, I said carefully. And if he succeeds, it proves he's ready for more. Richard nodded slowly. And if he fails? I stayed silent, letting Richard fill in that blank himself. In his mind, Matthew's failure would finally justify cutting him loose, maybe even removing him from the will. Richard didn't know that I was orchestrating that failure, that every piece was being positioned to destroy them both. By the end of that year, I had them all where I needed them. Matthew trusted me completely. Victoria had started confiding her husband's secrets, and Richard had made me his most trusted advisor. They were all standing on trapdoors I'd built, and none of them heard the creaking beneath their feet. The trap took 18 months to set properly. Every piece had to be perfect, every document authentic, every trail leading back to Richard, but never to me. I worked with the precision of a bomb maker, knowing that one wrong wire would destroy everything I'd built over 11 years. The evidence collection was meticulous. Richard trusted me with his passwords, his private files, his offshore accounts. During late nights in his office, I photographed everything: bank statements from the Caymans, bribes to city officials, the real books that showed how Callahan Enterprises laundered money through 12 shell companies. I wore a wire to meetings where Richard casually discussed destroying competitors through illegal means. Every crime, every confession, carefully cataloged and backed up in 3 separate locations. My network of Richard's victims became crucial. The farmer from Kansas had kept soil samples proving Callahan's chemical subsidiary had poisoned his land. The hotel owner's widow had recordings of Richard threatening her husband days before his suicide. The Arizona construction family had documented evidence of forged signatures on contracts. Each person had a piece, but alone they were nothing. Together, orchestrated correctly, they were an avalanche waiting to fall. The journalism angle required delicate handling. I chose Marcus Webb, an investigative reporter at the Denver Post who'd been trying to expose Callahan for years but could never get solid sources. I became his anonymous informant, deep throat for the corporate age, feeding him just enough to keep him hungry but not enough to publish. Yet, "This source of yours," Marcus said during one of our parking garage meetings, "they're inside Callahan Enterprises." "Very inside," I confirmed, handing him a flash drive with selective financial records. "But you can't move on this until you get the signal. When everything comes out, it has to be simultaneous, overwhelming. He can't have time to spin it or bury it." The FBI was trickier. I couldn't approach them directly, but I could make sure they found what they needed to find. I started making tiny mistakes in the company's federal filings, discrepancies that would trigger automated audits. I ensured that Matthew's secret deals left paper trails that crossed state lines, making them federal crimes. I accidentally forgot to delete emails discussing bribes to senators from the server during routine maintenance. Special Agent Diana Foster started sniffing around 6 months into my plan. She came in as a routine inquiry about interstate commerce violations. I was helpful but not too helpful. Competent but not suspicious. I made sure she got coffee from Richard's assistant, who nervously mentioned how many documents had been shredded lately. Small breadcrumbs leading to the feast of evidence I'd prepared. The most satisfying trap was the one Richard walked into willingly. Through my recommendations, he'd acquired 3 companies with hidden disasters: environmental violations, pension fraud, toxic assets disguised as gold mines. Each acquisition had Richard's signature all over it, his personal guarantee, his aggressive tactics preventing proper due diligence. The combined liability was over $800 million, enough to destroy even Callahan Enterprises. Meanwhile, I pushed Matthew deeper into his spiral. His Phoenix project was hemorrhaging money as my network filed injunction after injunction. His secret side deals were getting sloppier, more desperate. He'd started using cocaine to handle the stress, which I occasionally enabled by mentioning how many executives used it to maintain their edge. "Elena, I need your help," Matthew begged one night, pupils dilated, sweat staining his designer shirt. "The Phoenix project is falling apart. If my father finds out about the cost overruns—" "How much?" I asked, feigning concern. "40 million, maybe 50. I gasped appropriately. "Matthew, that's fraud at this scale. Your father he'll destroy me." Matthew finished. "Unless—" "What if we moved money from the pension fund? Just temporarily, just until Phoenix starts generating revenue." I acted reluctant, then slowly allowed him to convince me. We moved the money together, my fingers on the keyboard but his authorization codes making it happen. Another crime with his fingerprints all over it. Another weapon in my arsenal. Victoria, for her part, had started feeding me information without realizing it. Wine-fueled lunches where she'd mention Richard's meetings with senators, his cash payments to judges, his blackmail files on competitors. She thought she was just venting to a friend. She didn't know every word was being recorded. The beautiful complexity of the trap was that each part reinforced the others. The illegal acquisitions funded the bribes. The bribes enabled more acquisitions. Matthew's fraud covered up the failing projects. The environmental crimes were hidden by the financial crimes, which were hidden by the political crimes. It was a perfect circle of corruption. And I had documented every single step. By December of that year, I had enough evidence to destroy Richard Callahan 50 times over. FBI investigations, journalistic exposés, lawsuits from victims, testimonies from his own family, all loaded and aimed, waiting for my finger on the trigger. I stood in my apartment one night, looking at the wall of evidence I'd assembled. Photos, documents, recordings, financial records. 11 years of my life reduced to data points in a revenge equation. Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase. Tomorrow, Richard Callahan's empire would begin to burn, and he wouldn't even smell the smoke until it was too late. The unraveling started with whispers. Richard noticed it first in the boardroom, conversations that stopped when he entered, eyes that wouldn't quite meet his. Then came the resignation letters, senior executives suddenly finding better opportunities elsewhere. They could smell the rot I'd been carefully spreading, even if they couldn't identify the source. "Something's wrong," Richard said one January morning, standing at his window, watching the city below. "Someone's moving against us." I stood beside him, close enough to see the first stress lines cracking his composed facade. "The Morrison acquisition is still facing resistance. Maybe they've hired better lawyers." "No," he said slowly. "This is bigger, internal." The paranoia I'd cultivated was bearing fruit. Richard started investigating his own people, demanding loyalty tests, installing monitoring software on company computers. The atmosphere in Callahan Enterprises turned toxic, more toxic than usual. Employees were interrogated, phones were tapped, private investigators followed executives home. Richard was eating himself from the inside, and I was there to hand him the fork. "Sir, Matthew's been asking about the offshore accounts." I mentioned casually during a late-night session. It was true. I'd been the one to suggest he ask. Richard's face darkened. "My own son. Is he that stupid or that ambitious?" "Maybe both," I offered carefully. The FBI investigation escalated from routine to aggressive. Agent Foster's team started appearing more frequently, requesting more documents, interviewing more employees. Richard hired the best lawyers money could buy, but they were playing defense against an offense that had been preparing for over a decade. "They're asking about the Senator Bradshaw payments," Richard's lead attorney, Thomas Hutchinson, said during an emergency meeting. "They have specific dates, specific amounts." "Impossible," Richard snarled. "Those records were destroyed." But they weren't. I'd saved copies of everything before the shredding parties, stored them safely, and made sure Agent Foster received them through channels that could never be traced back to me. The press started circling like vultures. Marcus Webb published his first story, a small piece about environmental violations at a Callahan subsidiary. Richard killed it with legal threats and advertising leverage. But 2 more stories popped up elsewhere. Then 5, then 20. My network of victims had all gone to different journalists with their pieces of the puzzle. Richard's legal team couldn't plug holes that were appearing everywhere simultaneously. Matthew's collapse accelerated everything. The Phoenix Project had become a $50 million crater, and his attempts to cover it with pension funds had been discovered by the auditors I'd secretly tipped off. He came to his father's office on a Thursday morning, shaking, crying, confessing everything. "You pathetic little shit," Richard said, voice like ice. "You stole from the pension fund?" "I was trying to save the project. You put so much pressure." Richard hit him, not a slap, but a closed fist punch that sent Matthew sprawling. I watched from the doorway, feeling nothing. These men had destroyed families for sport. Watching them destroy each other was justice beginning to bloom. "Elena saw everything," Richard said, turning to me, she'll testify that you acted alone, that I had no knowledge. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, Richard asking me to lie for him, to save him. I nodded slowly, as if considering, then spoke carefully. Of course, Mr. Callahan, but the FBI will need to see all the financial records to believe Matthew acted alone, including the offshore accounts, to prove you weren't involved. Richard's eyes narrowed, calculating. He thought he was manipulating me, using me as his shield. He didn't realize he was handing me the sword. Do whatever's necessary, he said. The stress was breaking him down physically. He stopped sleeping, started drinking heavily. His hands developed a tremor. During meetings, he'd lose his train of thought, snap at shadows, see threats everywhere. Because threats were everywhere, I'd made sure of that. Victoria filed for divorce on a Tuesday, having mysteriously discovered the hidden assets that would nullify their prenup. She'd also found evidence of Richard's affairs, his illegitimate child in Miami, his payments to cover up sexual assault allegations. I'd left the evidence where she'd find it, of course. You're behind this, Richard accused one night, alcohol slurring his words. We were alone in his office, city lights glittering below. Behind what, sir? All of it, the FBI, the press, Matthew, Victoria. Someone's orchestrating this. I moved closer, my face a mask of concern. Mr. Callahan, you're exhausted. The stress is. I destroyed people for less than this, he continued, staring through me. Families, businesses, lives. Never lost sleep over it. Is that guilt I hear? He laughed, ugly and sharp. Guilt? No. Just wondering when my turn would come. You can't build an empire on graves without expecting to join them eventually. If only he knew he was confessing to the daughter of two of those graves. But my face remained sympathetic, supportive, even as my heart sang with savage satisfaction. The empire was crumbling, and Richard could feel it in his bones. The only question now was how far he'd fall when the last support beam, me, finally stepped away. The final blow came on a Wednesday morning in February. I arrived at the office early, placing a single manila envelope on Richard's desk before anyone else arrived. Inside were the crown jewels, evidence of the secret account in Switzerland holding $300 million skimmed from shareholders over 15 years. Account numbers, transaction histories, and most damning, the emails where Richard explicitly detailed his theft. When Richard arrived and opened the envelope, his face went from red to white to gray in seconds. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw fear in those cold eyes. Where did you get this? Does it matter? I asked calmly. The FBI will have copies within the hour. The Wall Street Journal, too. Your competitors at Brennan Holdings are particularly interested in the evidence about the Mayfair deal. You remember, the one where you bribed their CFO? You, he breathed, understanding finally dawning. You're the one. You've been behind everything. I stood, smoothing my skirt, maintaining Elena Moore's composure even as Claire Donovan screamed in triumph inside. The forensic accountants are downstairs. Agent Foster is personally leading the raid. They'll be here in approximately 10 minutes. Why? Richard stood, unsteady. A king realizing his kingdom was already gone. I made you. I trusted you. Why would you destroy everything? For a moment, I considered telling him about the hardware store in Broken Arrow, about my father's heart attack, my mother's empty eyes. But Richard wouldn't remember them anyway. They were just casualties number 247 and 248 in his rise to power. Business, I said simply. Nothing personal. The lie tasted sweet. Richard lunged for his computer, presumably to delete files, transfer money, salvage something. But I'd already changed his passwords, locked him out of his own systems. He grabbed his phone. I'd had it remotely wiped an hour ago. He was a king in a throne room I'd filled with gasoline, fumbling for matches that no longer existed. Elena, please. He actually begged. We can make a deal. I have cash hidden, gold, Properties you don't know about. 50 million, 100 million. Just stop this. Mr. Callahan, I said, moving toward the door. You once told me that business was about knowing when to close the deal. This deal is closed. The FBI agents entered like a tide in dark jackets. Agent Foster at the lead with a warrant and handcuffs. The look she gave me was knowing. She'd figured out I was the source weeks ago, but let me play it out. Smart woman. Richard Callahan, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit. I didn't stay for the full list. I walked out as they cuffed him, past the arriving news crews, past the employees gathering in shocked clusters. In the elevator, I removed the blonde wig I'd worn for 3 years, letting my natural auburn hair fall free. Elena Moore rode down to the lobby. Claire Donovan walked out. The next hours were orchestrated chaos. The Wall Street Journal's exclusive broke online, sending Callahan Enterprises stock into freefall. Trading was halted after it dropped 60%. The FBI raided 17 locations simultaneously. Matthew was arrested at his penthouse, cocaine still on the table. Victoria was on television within hours, playing the wronged wife, revealing Richard's darkest secrets to anyone with a camera. By market close, Callahan Enterprises had lost $3 billion in value. By evening, bankruptcy lawyers were circling. Richard's assets were frozen, his passport confiscated, his bail set at $50 million that he couldn't access. I watched it all from a bar downtown, drinking bourbon, Macallan 25, Richard's favorite, and watching his empire burn on every television screen. The other patrons were discussing it, shocked at the rapid fall of Denver's most powerful man. They didn't notice the woman in the corner booth, raising her glass in a silent toast to 2 graves in Broken Arrow. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb. Pulitzer-worthy story. Thank you, whoever you are. Another from Agent Foster. We need to talk about your future. You'd make a good agent. Another from Matthew. Somehow. Elena, please help me. I deleted them all. Elena Moore no longer existed. She'd served her purpose and died with Richard's empire. Tomorrow, the forensic accountants would find more. The victims would file lawsuits. The prosecutors would build cases that would take years to fully prosecute. Richard would spend the rest of his life in courtrooms and, eventually, in prison. His name would become synonymous with corporate corruption. His legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in business schools. But tonight, Claire Donovan sat alone, finally free from the weight of revenge that had defined her entire adult life. The empire had fallen. The wait was over. And for the first time in 11 years, I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. The strangest part? I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not joy, not even relief. Just empty. Like a house after the furniture's been moved out. Revenge, I realized, was a job that, once completed, left you unemployed in your own life. The federal courthouse in downtown Denver had never seen media coverage like this. Every major network, reporters from 40 states, international press, all here to witness the fall of Richard Callahan. I stood across the street, anonymous in the crowd, watching as armed federal agents led him from the transport van. He looked smaller somehow, the orange jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that had shrunk 20 pounds in 3 weeks. His silver hair, once perfectly styled, was unkempt. But it was his eyes that satisfied me most, hollow, defeated, understanding finally what it meant to lose everything. The trial would take months, maybe years. But the outcome was certain. My evidence was unassailable. The witnesses lined up like dominoes. Richard's own son had turned state's evidence to reduce his sentence. Victoria was writing a tell-all book. Every enemy Richard had ever made was emerging from the shadows, emboldened by his fall. Callahan Enterprises died faster than my parents had. The building was seized by federal agents, its assets liquidated to pay victims. The logo was removed from the tower on a Tuesday, the same day the bankruptcy was finalized. Within 6 months, it would be as if the company had never existed at all. I attended the auction where they sold off Richard's personal belongings, his art collection, his vintage cars, his watches, all reduced to lot numbers and starting bids. I bought one thing, a paperweight from his desk, a heavy crystal piece he'd probably never noticed. It cost me $12. I would eventually throw it in a lake somewhere. But for now, it served as proof that this had all been real. The night before I left Denver forever, it snowed. I walked past the dark tower that had once been Callahan Enterprises, my footsteps the only sound in the muffled silence. Looking up at the empty windows, I tried to feel something. Triumph, satisfaction, closure. But there was only the cold and the quiet and the strange realization that revenge hadn't brought my parents back. It had only added Richard to the list of the destroyed. A security guard emerged from the building, probably doing final rounds before it was sold. "Ma'am, you can't loiter here." "I used to work here," I said. "Yeah?" He looked tired, ready for his shift to end. Must have been something, working for Callahan. It was exactly what I expected. I walked away, leaving no footprints the snow couldn't cover. At the airport, Claire Donovan ceased to exist. The woman who boarded the plane to Seattle had a different name, a different past, a different future. The skills I'd learned, the manipulation, the patience, the careful documentation, could be used for something else now. Maybe something better. Agent Foster had been serious about that job offer. 3 months later, I read that Richard had been sentenced to 45 years without parole. He would die in prison, forgotten and alone. Matthew got 12 years. Victoria got immunity and a bestseller. The victims got settlements that would never truly compensate their losses. And me? I got the only thing revenge truly offers, an ending. Not satisfaction, not happiness, just a period at the end of a sentence that had run on for too long. I stood at my parents' graves on the anniversary of their deaths, the first time I'd visited in 11 years. The headstones were weathered but standing, which was more than could be said for Richard Callahan's legacy. "It's done," I told them, though I knew they couldn't hear. "He lost everything, just like you did, just like I did." The wind picked up, rustling through the Oklahoma grass, and for a moment I could almost pretend it was them answering. But it was just wind, just grass, just a daughter standing over stones that marked where love used to live. I left Broken Arrow that afternoon and never returned. There was nothing left there for me, no family, no home, no revenge left to plan. The girl who'd sworn vengeance in a cemetery was as dead as the people she'd sworn to avenge. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Richard thinks about me. If he lies in his cell, replaying every interaction, looking for the signs he missed. If he realizes that the woman who destroyed him had been shaped by his own cruelty. Forged in the fire he'd set? Probably not. Men like Richard never really understand the consequences of their actions. Even when those consequences are wearing orange jumpsuits in federal prison, revenge, I learned, is a poison you drink, hoping others will die. But sometimes, if you're patient enough, careful enough, and willing to lose yourself completely, sometimes the others do die. Whether that makes the poison worth drinking is a question I'll spend the rest of my life unable to answer. The empire fell. The king was dethroned. Justice, or something like it, was served. And somewhere in Denver, snow still falls on an empty tower, covering footprints that lead nowhere, from someone who no longer exists, carrying a weight that will never quite lift. The end. Thank you for listening to this story of revenge and justice. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Claire's position? Your perspectives make these stories come alive.